He was a millionaire used to dismissing street noise like static until one rainy afternoon. A barefoot girl tugged his coat and whispered, "I know how to make your son walk again." People laughed. She had nothing but a torn bag and a pair of eyes that refused to look away. And yet, something in her voice stopped him cold. Who was she, and how could she know anything about his son? If you believe that answers sometimes come from the most forgotten corners, stay close, like share, or leave a thought your voice might be what keeps this kind of story alive. The rooftop of the Peninsula, New York, shimmered with polished elegance. Manhattan's skyline framed the evening like a painting, flawless, distant, untouchable. Waiters in black moved like dancers between tables lit with tapered candles, their silver trays a quiet rhythm under the music of a live-string quartet. Jonathan Sinclair stood near the edge, his hand resting lightly on the back of a wheelchair. His son, Oliver, 11, sat quietly beneath a navy wool blanket, his face pale in the amber glow. His legs, immobile since the accident last spring, were wrapped in custom orthopedic braces. Jonathan barely heard the voices surrounding him, old investors, real estate partners, board members offering gentle condolences masked as compliments. "He's strong," one of them had said earlier, "like his father." Jonathan hadn't answered. A soft gust moved through the rooftop, stirring the floral arrangements. Just as a toast was raised near the dessert table, a sharp slam cut through the string music. A door swung open. Gasps spread before the crowd fully understood what they were seeing. A girl, no older than 10 or 11, burst onto the polished stone floor, barefoot, her jeans soaked to the knee, her oversized hoodie clinging wet to her small frame. Her curls were damp, wild around her face. She moved fast, weaving between chairs, startling a group of donors near the terrace railing. A waiter dropped a tray. The violinist stopped playing mid-note. She reached Jonathan before anyone could block her, her eyes locked onto his wide, alive, too steady for a child. "I know how to make your son walk again," she said, her voice thin but firm. It silenced the rooftop. Jonathan stared. A second passed, then 3. Security guards moved quickly. One grabbed the girl by the arm. Another tried to apologize to the guests, but no one heard him. All eyes were fixed on her. Jonathan took a step forward, uncertain whether to speak or retreat. But the moment was already gone. The girl twisted in the guard's grip and looked back, directly at him again. "I'm not lying," she said. His legs, they don't need to stay asleep. Then she was gone, pulled through the glass doors like a stain being scrubbed away. The music resumed, hesitantly. A woman in diamonds whispered, "Homeless." Another added, "Where's her mother?" Jonathan said nothing. His fingers tightened on the back of Oliver's chair. Oliver, who hadn't spoken a full sentence all evening, finally looked up at his father. "She looked like she meant it," he said softly. The party limped on. People recovered. Laughter returned, though thinner now. Jonathan stayed until the end, making rounds, saying the right things. But all the while, his mind replayed those eyes. They weren't desperate. They weren't begging. They were certain. Outside, the rain was falling harder. As he walked with Oliver through the parking structure, he noticed something small and dark beneath the windshield wiper of his Bentley, a folded paper towel. Curious. He peeled it free. It was soggy, barely legible, but in the faint glow of the overhead light, he made out 5 words written in uneven pencil. Hudson Valley, Mr. Cohen. Help. He looked around. No one was there. Behind him. Oliver sneezed. Jonathan opened the door and helped his son into the car, but his eyes lingered on the street. Something wasn't finished. Something had started. He didn't know what yet, but he knew that girl hadn't just stumbled in. She had come for him. Jonathan Sinclair had never been one to lose sleep, not even during mergers, lawsuits, or the slow-motion collapse of his first marriage. But tonight, high above Central Park South in a condo wrapped in glass and silence, he couldn't rest. Oliver slept a few feet away in his hospital-style bed, a custom gurney of Swedish design. His legs, still and pale beneath the quilt, twitched faintly in his dreams, but Jonathan knew better than to hope. The doctors had been clear: spinal trauma, incomplete but stubborn. Recovery was possible in theory, not in practice. Jonathan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, arms crossed, watching the blur of traffic below. In the reflection, he saw a man who had everything except control, except certainty. He kept replaying her words, not the drama of her entrance or the embarrassment of the interruption. Just the voice, steady and strange. "I know how to make your son walk again." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a scam. It had sounded settled. At 2:17 a.m., he sat down with his laptop and began typing. Manhattan rooftop party girl intrusion. Child crashes event. Missing young girl, New York homeless. He dug through online police blotters, shelter reports, emergency intake records. Nothing. He opened the city's social services database, something only donors like him had special access to, and typed in rough descriptions. Age range 9 to 12. Race biracial. Keywords: Hudson Valley, Mr. Cohen. Still nothing. The cursor blinked at him like it was daring him to believe. The next morning, Jonathan skipped the executive board meeting at Sinclair Holdings. It wasn't hard. They'd survived without him before. He pulled his coat on, grabbed his keys, and took his personal car down Riverside Drive toward the Upper West Side, ending up at the 20th Precinct Station on West 82nd. The officer behind the desk looked up from his screen with a polite, weary smile. "How can I help you?" Jonathan leaned forward. "I need to access the building surveillance from last night, the rooftop of the peninsula. A child entered our event uninvited." The officer shook his head. "Sir, unless a crime was committed or a missing person filed, we don't release footage, not even to the host." Jonathan pressed, dropped his name. It didn't change the answer. Frustrated, he walked back to his car, parked under an elm tree, still holding its late October leaves. He clicked the fob. The car blinked. As he reached for the handle, he saw it wedged under the wiper. A folded piece of paper, damp around the edges. He peeled it free and opened it right there on the sidewalk, the chill wind cutting through his scarf. The note was written in pencil, smudged and crooked. 4 words: a name, a place. Hudson Valley, Mr. Cohen. He helped me. There was no signature, no address. But Jonathan's fingers tightened around the paper like it held oxygen. He slid into the car, shut the door, and sat with the engine off. Oliver's face flashed in his mind, not sick or broken, but just still. Frozen in time, the car remained unmoving. Outside, a mother crossed the street with her child in a red coat, the girl skipping on one leg for no reason at all. Jonathan turned the ignition, but didn't shift to drive. He just sat there, staring at the note, letting it burn its way into him. One letter at a time. 1 week after the rooftop incident, Jonathan found himself driving away from everything that defined his life. Manhattan was long behind him, replaced by winding 2-lane roads lined with thinning trees and shades of rust and gold. The sky overhead was a dull stretch of cloud, low and heavy. Fall in Hudson Valley always carried a kind of silence, the kind that seemed to watch you from the hills. The directions were vague. Maya had called from a payphone, her voice steady but clipped, giving him landmarks instead of addresses. Past the red barn with the crooked weather vane, turn where the stone wall breaks. Look for a dirt road marked by a rusted mailbox with no name. It sounded like folklore. Still, he followed. The black SUV rumbled over gravel until the trees parted to reveal a clearing, and within it, a small wooden house with cedar shingles and ivy curling up its porch railings. No welcome mat, no mailbox, no signs of technology except a single weathered truck parked to the side. Maya stood near the front steps, her sweatshirt sleeves pulled over her hands. She looked smaller in this quiet, surrounded by nature instead of skyscrapers, but no less certain. Beside her stood an elderly man in a navy wool coat. His white beard was thick, his face weathered, his eyes a sharp gray that didn't blink much. He said nothing, just nodded once. "Mr. Cohen," Maya said. This is Oliver's dad." Jonathan got out slowly. His son remained in the passenger seat, wide-eyed, his hands resting on his lap. Inside the house, it smelled of dried herbs and old wood. There were no machines, no treatment tables, no sterile lighting, just bookshelves, blankets, a tea kettle hissing quietly on the stove. The furniture looked handmade. The walls were bare except for one small photograph of a young girl in a wheelchair, Maya, maybe a few years younger. Jonathan helped Oliver into a soft armchair. He scanned the room, uneasy. "You don't use any equipment?" he asked. "Mr." Cohen looked at him but didn't answer. Maya knelt on the floor in front of Oliver. "We'll try something simple," she said gently. "Close your eyes. Think about your toes, not whether they move. Just think about them. Feel where they are." Oliver did as he was told. His face didn't change, but his fingers curled slightly at the sides of the chair. Jonathan hovered, arms crossed. Every instinct told him to interrupt, to ask about credentials, liability, what insurance would say. But then Oliver's lips parted, and he whispered, "They're cold." It was the first time he'd described sensation below the waist in 6 months. Nobody moved. Maya smiled, but said nothing. Cohen turned back to the stove. Jonathan let out a breath and sat down, slowly, as if something inside him had shifted and hadn't quite settled yet. They stayed for nearly 2 hours. No promises were made, no breakthroughs celebrated. Just quiet exercises, a few cups of warm chamomile tea, and an atmosphere that seemed older than science. When they were ready to leave, Maya walked with them to the car. Before Jonathan could open the door, she pulled something from her pocket, a faded photo, its corners bent. She handed it to him. In the image, a much younger Maya lay in a narrow bed, her legs wrapped in braces, eyes closed, arms limp at her side. Beside her sat Mr. Cohen, one hand on her forehead, the other holding hers. On the back, written in childish block letters, "I couldn't walk either." Jonathan didn't speak. He simply took the photo, slipped it into his coat pocket, and nodded. The drive home was quiet. Oliver dozed off around Cold Spring, his head against the window. Jonathan drove with one hand, the other still resting on the steering wheel, his mind circling back to the house, the girl, the way Oliver's voice had changed when he said cold, just past Terrytown. He turned on the seat heater for the first time in months. He didn't know if what they'd witnessed was real progress or suggestion. He didn't know if Cohen was a miracle worker or a deluded recluse. But as the city skyline began to reappear in the distance, he kept one hand in his pocket, fingers brushing against the old photograph, like it might answer questions he hadn't yet learned how to ask. 2 days later, Jonathan drove back up the Hudson alone. No Oliver this time. No conversation to fill the space between highway signs. Just the soft hum of the engine and the quiet ticking of thoughts, refusing to resolve. He left before dawn, hoping to arrive before the day stretched too far and made him think too much. The trees lining the drive had shifted since his last visit. More bare limbs, fewer bursts of orange. The house looked smaller this time, like it had pulled itself further into the earth. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney, but the porch light was off. It wasn't meant to be welcoming. He parked the car and stepped onto the creaking wooden steps. Maya opened the door before he could knock, as if she had been waiting. "He's inside," she said, then turned and walked back in. Jonathan followed her into the same warm, scented room, where nothing had changed, the kettle whistling softly, the light from a single window slanting onto the floor, the blanket still folded on the armchair where Oliver had sat. But this time, Cohen was standing by the hearth, stirring the fire with a steel poker. Jonathan didn't bother with niceties. "I want to know who you are," he said, "where you learned this, what you've done." Cohen didn't turn around. "You already know who I am." "I know nothing," Jonathan snapped, "except that my son said he felt something here, which is more than he's said in months, and that frightens me more than it should." Cohen finally looked over his shoulder. His face was unreadable. "Fear is a good start. Don't patronize me." Cohen left the poker by the hearth and walked into the back of the house. Jonathan stood frozen, unsure whether to follow or leave. He stayed. When Cohen returned, Maya was with him, holding a manila folder. She passed it to Jonathan with both hands, like it might break. He sat down and opened it slowly. Inside were brittle pages, certificates, transcripts, faded photos, a medical degree from Cornell, a black and white picture of a younger Cohen in a lab coat, standing in a group of 5 at Johns Hopkins, smiling faintly. Then, the last page, a yellowing article, clipped from a Baltimore paper. The headline read, "Pediatric Neurologist Resigns Amid Controversy Over Mind-Body Therapy." Jonathan read every word. The article described an 8-year-old girl with partial paralysis who, under Cohen's care, had regained movement in her lower limbs after 8 weeks of guided mental and sensory training. No surgery, no drugs, no measurable cause, just a shift. The hospital board had called it irresponsible, unscientific, dangerous. The story ended with Cohen's resignation and an editor's note. The line between faith and fraud remains thin. Jonathan closed the folder and held it in his lap. "So you walked away," he said. "After 1 case. After 10. Cohen answered, "Only 1 made the paper." Jonathan didn't speak. His fingers tapped the edge of the folder, slow and steady. Maya stood to the side, arms crossed, watching both men. "Why didn't you fight it?" Jonathan asked. "Why disappear? I didn't disappear," Cohen said. I stepped aside. "The world doesn't reward what it doesn't understand." Jonathan looked up. "And you expect me to let my son be your next experiment?" Cohen's expression didn't change. "I expect you to ask what your son wants." Silence returned to the room. The only sound was the shifting of firewood, the faint sigh of wind against the house. "I'm not a man who believes easily," Jonathan said. "I know," Cohen replied. When Jonathan stood, his legs felt heavy. He moved to the door, folder under his arm, unsure if he was walking towards something or away. Maya followed him onto the porch. "He believed in me," she said softly, when nobody else even looked. Jonathan turned to her. "You said you couldn't walk either." She nodded, and now she pointed to her feet. "Now I run. I don't always get far, but I run." He studied her, trying to find the lie, the exaggeration, the sales pitch. There was none. Just a girl with a memory and the weight of proof in her posture. She looked at him one last time before he stepped off the porch. "Oliver doesn't need a miracle," she said. "He needs a father who's willing to believe before the science does." He didn't answer. Back in the car, he placed the folder on the passenger seat. He didn't drive straight back to the city. Instead, he turned the car around slowly, let the tires grind the gravel under them, and headed once again down the dirt road to get his son. The next morning, the sun barely rose through the thick gray sky. Jonathan bundled Oliver into the back of the SUV, wrapping a wool scarf around his son's neck, even though the heater would make it unnecessary. The boy didn't protest. He hadn't said much all morning. Maybe he sensed the shift in his father, something quieter than certainty, but more solid than hope. As they left Manhattan, the city gave way to silence. The roads thinned, and the sky pressed closer. Oliver looked out the window, his breath fogging the glass. Jonathan didn't speak. He kept one hand steady on the wheel, and the other resting beside the folder Cohen had given him, now worn at the edges. The dirt path was just as Maya had described it a week ago, but this time, something was wrong. A county patrol car was parked sideways across the entrance, its lights off. Standing next to it was a man in a tailored gray suit, shoes too clean for the terrain, hands tucked neatly into his coat pockets. Jonathan pulled to a slow stop, stepped out. The man approached without hurry, pulling out a leather wallet and flipping it open. "Dean Hargrove," he said. "Office of Professional Medical Oversight, State of New York." Jonathan didn't return the greeting. "There's been a report," Hargrove said calmly. "Anonymous tip. Alleged medical treatment without a license being conducted on a minor." Jonathan let the silence stretch. "You do understand," Hargrove continued, "that exposing your son to unlicensed therapy opens you to potential charges, parental negligence, medical endangerment." Behind him, Oliver had rolled down the window. He was listening. Jonathan crossed his arms. "And what constitutes therapy? exactly talking breathing exercises? Or is it just the location that offends you? Hargrove didn't flinch. You know as well as I do, Mr. Sinclair, that your name turns whispers into headlines, one wrong decision, and the world doesn't see a concerned father. They see liability. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Oliver's voice came quietly from the car. I want to try. Hargrove looked over, then back to Jonathan. Children don't get to decide what's safe. That's your job. Then the door to the house creaked open. Maya stepped out, jacket zipped to her chin, eyes sharp. She didn't look like a child anymore. She stood between the threshold and the world like she'd done it 100 times before. This isn't therapy. She called out, this is a place where someone actually listens. Hargrove gave her a glance like he was inspecting a stain. Miss, I suggest you return inside, but she didn't move. You're not here for the truth. You're here to make sure no one else sees it. That stopped Hargrove for a beat. He turned back to Jonathan. Midtown has 6 state-certified pediatric rehab centers. They would welcome your son, all properly equipped, all properly insured. Jonathan looked down at the gravel, then up again, and none of them made my son feel his own feet. Hargrove's smile was thin. Feelings aren't facts. No, Jonathan said, but sometimes they're the beginning of one. Hargrove took a step closer, lowering his voice. Don't be naive. Do you know how much they'd pay to keep you within system contracts? Your name's tied to 4 private clinics. Your lawyer knows what's at stake. He turned to leave, but not before adding, if you proceed, we open a file. If anything goes wrong, you won't get to explain afterward. Jonathan stood there long after the patrol car had driven off. He felt the cold seep into his coat, but his hands didn't tremble. Not yet. They didn't go inside. Not today. He drove back in silence. Oliver didn't ask why. He only sat, shoulders tense, eyes lowered. That night, as the city pulsed below their apartment windows, Jonathan stood in the kitchen with a glass of water, staring at nothing. Then the phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A woman's voice, soft and fast. You don't know me, but you should know this. Your private physician reported the sessions, not for safety, for contract control. They've got $4 million riding on keeping you in Midtown. They can't afford a miracle outside their name. Then the line clicked dead. Jonathan stayed still, glass untouched. In a city built on contracts and caution, someone had pulled the first thread. The morning came with fog blanketing Central Park like a second skin. Jonathan stood in his study, a space of clean lines and muted tones, the kind of room designed for decisive men. But this morning, he didn't feel decisive. He felt unsure in a way that crawled under his tailored shirt and settled in his chest. He called Mount Sinai just after 8 a.m., bypassing assistants and receptionists, using his name the way people use keys. By noon, a courier delivered a thick envelope to the doorman downstairs. It contained Oliver's entire medical record diagnoses, rehab assessments, MRI scans, and physician notes compiled over the course of a year. Jonathan spread the papers across the long oak table in the dining room. The afternoon light angled through the tall windows, catching the edges of the documents. He read each line slowly, as if looking for something that had been missed. Most of it, he already knew. Spinal contusion, limited motor response, no conclusive prognosis, words he had memorized and hated. But near the back of the packet, something slipped out, a beige envelope, unsealed, yellowed along the edges. No hospital logo, just handwriting across the front to Dr. Cohen, in gratitude. He sat down. The letter inside was short, written in pen on lined paper, the kind you'd find in a drawer no one touches anymore. Dear Dr. Cohen, I don't know if you remember me, but I remember everything. 7 months after the accident, I took my first steps not just back to walking, but back to life. You didn't promise me recovery. You offered me belief when no one else dared. You didn't cure me. You reminded me I wasn't broken beyond repair. You helped me see myself again. I owe you more than mobility. I owe you the truth that I was still worth the fight. Forever thankful. Janet Whitmore. Jonathan held the page between his fingers, reading it again. The name wasn't just familiar, it was powerful. Janet Whitmore. He knew her from industry circles, not medicine. A former trial attorney turned policy advocate, now serving as one of the key voices on the New York State Medical Grant Advisory Board. Her face had been on newsletters and public service panels. She was the kind of woman who could shift conversations in state buildings with one well-placed sentence. He stared at the letter. She hadn't sent it through channels. She hadn't made it public. But she had written it. And someone, probably Cohen, had kept it buried in silence, tucked inside a folder no one was meant to open. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the weight of it settling in. Maybe this wasn't just about a girl who could walk again. Maybe this wasn't about miracles at all. Maybe it was about how people decide what deserves attention and what gets erased. In the next room, Oliver rolled into view. He had taken to moving around more lately, even if just from one side of the apartment to the other. It was subtle, but Jonathan noticed. The boy stopped at the doorway. "Dad," Oliver asked, his voice uncertain. "If I really try, will you believe me?" Jonathan turned, stood up slowly, and walked over. He knelt beside the chair and rested a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "I already do," he said. "Even if you don't walk tomorrow, even if it's slow, or strange, or doesn't look like what they expect, I believe you can find your way." Oliver didn't speak, but his eyes glistened in the soft light. His lips pressed together. Jonathan saw the fear in his face, but also something else. Not hope, exactly, not yet. But the room was no longer quiet in the same way. That evening, Jonathan made the call. He didn't go through her office. He called her private line, found in the contact archive of an old benefit gala years ago. She picked up after 2 rings. "This is Janet Whitmore," Jonathan said evenly. "This is Jonathan Sinclair. We met once, Board of Civic Health Foundation." A pause. "I remember, I found something today," he said. "A letter. Yours. Written to Dr. Cohen." Another pause. "Then I see. I'd like to talk." He said, "In person." Her voice softened. "Are you calling to discredit him?" "No," Jonathan said. "I'm calling because I need to understand how you stood up again when the world told you you wouldn't." There was a beat of quiet. "Then come tomorrow morning. My office in Tribeca, early, before the politics wake up." Jonathan wrote down the address and time, folded the note into his pocket, in the hallway. Oliver was watching him again, wordless, curious. Jonathan didn't explain. He just nodded once, slow and sure, like something inside him had turned toward daylight. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt longer than it should have. The building at 146 West 57th Street stood in the heart of Midtown, but the silence on this floor made it feel far from anything that pulsed. No music in the lobby, no hum of typing, just the dull thud of Jonathan's shoes against polished marble. He was led past a small reception desk into a corner office, framed by floor-to-ceiling glass. A wall of books stood behind the desk, all legal volumes, with a single orchid in bloom near the window. Janet Whitmore stood when he entered, though her frame was smaller than he remembered from photos. She looked older, gray streaks through dark hair, lines deeper around the eyes, but there was a clarity in her presence that hadn't faded. She gestured toward the leather chair across from her without smiling. "You're here about Cohen," she said, before he could speak. Jonathan nodded, taking a seat. "I found something," he said. "A letter. It was in my son's medical file, addressed to him, from you." Janet didn't react at first. Then, after a breath, she leaned back in her chair and looked past him for a moment. "I wrote that the year after the accident," she said, "in a motel room just outside Albany. I never mailed it." "Why not?" She gave a dry chuckle, not unkind. "Because I was still clinging to who I had been before the crash, a trial attorney with a public face. And back then, believing in something unapproved was a liability." Jonathan studied her face. "But what you wrote, Was it true? Janet's gaze returned to his, this time softer. He didn't promise I'd walk again. He didn't diagnose or prescribe. He listened. He sat with me for hours some days, saying nothing at all. And every morning, I felt something inside me shift, a fraction, half a step, then a full one. Jonathan nodded, slowly. He wasn't used to these kinds of confessions quiet, without defense. Then you owe him. Janet didn't flinch. We all do. But we live in a world that owes nothing to those who don't play by its rules. Jonathan opened his mouth, but she raised a hand, stopping him gently. I'm not saying don't protect your son. I'm saying, if your son already believes in himself, don't be the person who teaches him not to. He exhaled. The weight behind her words lingered more than the letter had. Janet stood, extending a hand not to shake, but to hold. Whatever you decide, make sure it's yours, not theirs, not the system's. He nodded. For a moment, they just stood there in that high office, two people who had once needed permission to heal. Now, maybe they had something else. When he stepped into the elevator, he checked his phone. A message blinked on screen. No name, just text. Maya just left Cohen's house, walking alone toward the Hudson. The elevator doors closed slowly, and in the reflection, Jonathan didn't see the city behind him. He only saw the weight of timing. The rain had turned steady by the time Jonathan spotted her. Maya was curled beneath the rusted shelter of a long abandoned bus stop near Hudson River Park. Knees pulled to her chest, the fabric of her jeans soaked through. Her arms clutched a faded canvas bag like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. Jonathan parked on the shoulder, ignoring the puddles forming fast along the curb. He didn't bring an umbrella. Didn't think to. He walked toward her in the downpour, suit jacket already plastered to his back. Maya didn't look up when he approached. Her lips were pressed tight, her shoulders stiff with defiance or fear, maybe both. He knelt slowly beside her. I heard you left, he said quietly. She didn't answer at first. Then her voice came, rough, from cold, or holding back too long. He told me to go. Said I was too close now, that they'll come after me next. Jonathan looked at the canvas bag in her arms. One side sagged open, revealing papers, handwritten notes, worn medical diagrams, letters folded and unfolded too many times. What's that? He asked. She hesitated, then opened the flap wider. Inside were pages of observations, sketches of pressure points, daily recovery logs, all in Cohen's slanted handwriting. A book not bound, but lived through. A record of those no one else had believed could recover. He never kept files on a computer, she murmured. Said machines can be corrupted, but a hand can't lie about pain. Jonathan's breath clouded in the air. And what about you? Why are you still here? She looked up then, eyes reddened but clear. Because I know what it's like to be told you won't get better, to be called a case, not a person. But he didn't look at me like that. And when I saw your son, her throat caught. I saw me, the part of me that almost gave up. A car door slammed, both their heads turned. Across the street, a black government sedan had pulled up quietly. Dean Hargrove stepped out, carrying a waterproof folder like a weapon. His hair was dry, his coat flawless despite the rain. Mr. Sinclair, he called across the street, voice sharp, amplified by authority. We've issued a formal warning. Continuing with this unlicensed individual in your son's care will result in immediate escalation to state-level disciplinary action. Jonathan rose slowly, turning to face him. The water dripped off his collar, down the line of his jaw, but he didn't flinch. Maya remained seated. Hargrove approached, stopping just short of the shelter. This girl is not medically certified. She is acting as an accessory to a man already under investigation. If you involve her, you endanger her and your son. Jonathan said nothing at first. Then he looked back at Maya, at the way her small hands clutched that fragile bag of knowledge like it mattered more than protection. You're wrong, he said. She's not the one endangering him. It's all of you who gave up too early. Hargrove's expression tightened. I will file this. The Department of Child Services may get involved." Jonathan didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to Maya. "You got this far for Oliver. Now it's my turn." He held out a hand. She looked at it, hesitating only a breath, then reached up and let him pull her to her feet. The bag clutched in one arm, her soaked jacket clinging to her frame. She followed him without a word as he led her toward his car. Rain hit the windshield in soft fists as they pulled away, neither of them speaking. In the rearview mirror, Hargrove stood watching, silent, still, waiting for the system to do what it always did. But for the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't driving toward what was safe. He was driving toward what felt right. The wind coming off the river carried a chill that bit through wool suits and leather briefcases. Jonathan parked the car just outside the old courthouse in downtown Beacon, its brick facade weathered, the windows clouded from decades of bureaucratic breath. It wasn't a courtroom in the traditional sense, just a converted town hall meeting space, but today, it might as well have been a battleground. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle, facing a long wooden table where Dean Hargrove sat, flanked by two representatives from the Regional Health Authority. Their nameplates were plain, but their expressions were heavy with process. Maya sat 2 rows back, smaller than usual, her shoulders drawn in, her fingers curled tight around Cohen's notebook. Her eyes darted toward Jonathan when he entered. He gave her a small nod, but there was no smile. Not today. Mr. Cohen hadn't come. He'd refused. Hope isn't something you debate in front of lawyers. He had said. Jonathan didn't argue with him. Some fights, Cohen believed, were best fought in silence. Jonathan stepped up alone. No legal counsel, no supporting staff, just him and a USB drive. The projector screen flickered. A muted clip appeared a dimly lit room. Oliver seated on a woven mat, Maya kneeling beside him. She spoke slowly, calmly. Oliver mirrored her breath, deep, focused. At second 49, his right big toe jerked, not a spasm, a choice. Then it twitched again. The screen went black. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the mechanical hum of the heater kicking on. Hargrove didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "This could be a reflex," he said. "Spinal pathways retain certain autonomous responses. It proves nothing therapeutic." "It proves," Jonathan said quietly, "that something changed, whether your paperwork agrees or not." One of the health officials leaned forward. "Mr. Sinclair, even if we believed this was progress, what you've done falls outside approved clinical protocols. You've put your son in the hands of an unlicensed minor and a man without standing." Jonathan didn't back down. "What I've done," he replied, "is give my son one thing none of you ever did permission to try." Hargrove stood. His voice was firm, colder now. "The board reserves the right to request cessation of all activities conducted at Mr. Cohen's residence, effective pending full investigation. Any further sessions will be considered a violation. No vote, no gavel, just a declaration." Jonathan left the chamber without another word. Maya followed him through the hallway, steps quick, clutching the notebook like it might disappear. She caught up to him just outside, under the pale sky. "They won't believe us," she said. "They'll shut it down, because nobody wants to admit something works if it didn't come from a lab." Jonathan looked down at her. She looked impossibly small beneath the wide gray clouds, but her voice didn't shake. "Then we'll have to show them," he said. They stood there for a beat, traffic humming behind them, the courthouse door shutting with a wooden thud. In the distance, beyond the row of buildings, the trees that lined the edge of Hudson Valley swayed under the wind, quiet witnesses to a battle that wasn't over yet. The sky outside was still slate gray, the kind of color that settled over the valley before the sun dared to rise. Inside the wooden cottage, the air was warm, but no one moved quickly. There was a kind of hush that belonged to sacred mornings. Oliver sat cross-legged on the mat, his spine upright, his face calm. Maya sat opposite him, her voice steady and soft. Let your breath fall into your belly. Think of walking, of each step landing on soft earth. Her hands moved gently, guiding without touching. Mr. Cohen stood by the window, arms crossed, eyes distant but alert. His silhouette was a shadow cast by years of waiting, watching others doubt what he knew to be possible. In the corner, near the old stone fireplace, Jonathan sat in a creaking wooden chair. He didn't speak, didn't offer advice. For the first time in years, he allowed silence to lead. And in that silence, something inside him loosened. Oliver closed his eyes. His fingers trembled slightly on his knees. Then, without sound, the smallest shift a toe moved. Then again, his heel followed, bending at the ankle. Maya noticed, but said nothing, just a nod. Then a whisper only the boy could hear. You're doing it. Cohen moved slowly, placing a cushion behind Oliver as the boy leaned forward. Sweat formed at his temples. His breathing changed more forceful now, determined. He planted his palms on the mat, trying to push up. The movement was clumsy, his arms too thin to lift much weight, but his knees buckled beneath him, caught and held. Jonathan stood. His hands hovered near, unsure if he should help, unsure if helping would break the spell. Then it happened. Oliver shifted his weight and, with one knee still bent, he brought a foot forward. It wobbled. His body wobbled, but the foot touched down. It wasn't a step in the grand sense, but it was his. Jonathan sank to his knees. His chest heaved. He hadn't realized he'd stopped breathing until his lungs forced air through tears. You did it, he said, choking on the words. You really did it. Oliver. Oliver didn't speak, but he turned, slowly, and reached for his father's hand. Their fingers met. Tight. Sure. In that grasp was something neither of them had felt since the accident, since Emily had slipped away in the hospital bed without warning belief. Jonathan didn't notice the phone vibrating in his pocket at first. Maya picked it up and handed it to him gently. The screen lit with a name, Janet Whitmore. He answered, his voice still raw. I saw it, he said quietly. He moved. Janet didn't respond right away. Then, her voice came through, low and cautious. I believe you. But listen, Hargrove. He's not doing this just for regulation. Years ago, Cohen turned down a private foundation grant that Hargrove helped arrange. It cost him reputation, money. He's not just fighting bad science. He's fighting a man he's wanted erased for 20 years. Jonathan looked at Cohen, still by the window, back turned to them all. What are you saying I'm saying? Janet replied. If you don't push back now, he'll bury this before it has a chance to breathe. Outside, the light had changed. The trees were beginning to glow in pale gold. Oliver looked out the window, then back at Maya. The cafe in Kingston was quiet that night. Dim yellow bulbs hung from exposed beams. The place smelled of burnt espresso and old books. And in the corner booth, near the window, Janet Whitmore sat across from Jonathan with something heavy between them. A thick manila envelope, aged and unmarked, except for the faint ink stamp of a private medical courier long out of service. This was never digitized, Janet said quietly. His daughter's file. No one knows it exists. It wasn't filed with the department. Jonathan reached forward slowly, as if expecting it to be warm. He opened it. Inside, medical reports from late 2012, spinal trauma, incomplete paralysis, dozens of failed interventions, then a short 3-month timeline with Mr. Cohen's name scrawled in clinic notes. No improvement noted. No discharge. Just a line. Patient voluntarily ceased treatment. Family declined to continue. Satim. After that, the file went silent. And tucked between those pages, a single sheet of paper, folded once, torn along the top, handwritten. It wasn't addressed. It wasn't signed in full, but it was unmistakably personal. He didn't try to fix me. He asked what I missed most. I told him my dog. He said, then let's sit together and miss her properly. No one had ever said that to me, not even my parents. For the first time, I wasn't a case. Jonathan read it twice, then lowered it. Janet didn't rush him. She only sipped from her cold mug and waited. "When was this written?" he asked. Finally. 2 weeks before her father pulled her out of Cohen's care and filed the first complaint. Janet said, "She mailed it to my office years later, unsigned. I kept it because I thought it mattered. Now I know it does." Jonathan leaned back, eyes still on the page. It wasn't the words that broke him. It was the quiet behind them, the ache of someone being heard for the first time. He looked at Janet. So this was personal. Not about law, not about science, not just... She replied. Hargrove tried to protect his pride. He turned pain into punishment, and now he's using the system to erase what he couldn't accept. The weight of that sentence settled hard. Jonathan took the file, tucking it into his coat. "I don't want to destroy him," he said quietly, "but I won't let him keep destroying hope." Janet smiled faint, tired. "Then don't fight him. Show them what he's trying to hide." Outside, the wind had picked up. Tree limbs swayed against the windows. Autumn leaves skittered along the sidewalk. On the drive back through the narrow roads of the Hudson Valley, Maya sat beside Jonathan, her eyes tracing the dark outlines of trees rushing past. He spoke without turning. "Tomorrow, we hold a demonstration, Central Park, wide open, cameras, walkers, strangers. If they won't come to the truth, we'll bring the truth to them." Maya didn't answer, but after a few miles, she pulled out Cohen's notebook from her bag and opened it to a page marked with a ribbon, one of the old diagrams, one of the breath exercises. She began to read aloud slowly, steadily, as if preparing for something neither of them could yet name. The road ahead stretched quiet, but in the rearview mirror, the storm clouds were catching up. It was the kind of Sunday morning New Yorkers rarely noticed: clear skies, soft breeze, and the faint smell of roasted peanuts from the vendors near Central Park West. But this morning, a different crowd had gathered, not for a marathon, not for a protest. Just a quiet patch of grass surrounded by folding chairs, marked by a hand-painted sign tied loosely to a tree, Oliver's First Steps. There were no microphones, no banners, no campaign colors, yet the air held a kind of weight that didn't need volume. News crews had shown up, tipped off by someone anonymous. Locals came out of curiosity. Joggers slowed. Parents with strollers paused. The front row was reserved for no one, but Jonathan stood off to the side anyway, without his suit jacket, without the polish, just a father, just a man. Maya crouched beside Oliver near a low wooden platform built only for visibility. She adjusted the fabric straps around his waist, then met his eyes. "You don't need to prove anything," she whispered. "You just need to do this for you." Oliver nodded, lips pressed tight. The boy had barely spoken since arriving, but something in the way he looked up steady, not searching, was louder than words. He placed both hands on the walker. His fingers trembled as they tightened around the grips. One breath, then another. And then, the first lift. His right foot rose slowly, hovered just above the wooden floor, and touched back down. The motion was unsteady, unsure. But it was his. The crowd didn't react. No one knew whether to cheer or wait. He shifted his weight forward, another step, then another. On the fourth, his knee buckled, a breath caught in the crowd. But Jonathan moved forward without panic, just enough to place one hand on his son's back, not to catch him, just to let him know he was there. Oliver straightened. He didn't fall. From the fringe of the gathering, Janet Whitmore watched quietly. She wore no name tag, no badge. She held a single envelope in her hand, the edges worn and softened from travel. When she spotted Hargrove near the barricade-line pressed suit, stiff jaw, she didn't wait for permission. She walked up to him. Without speaking, she placed the envelope in his palm. His fingers closed around it reflexively, before he even looked at her face. He opened it right there. His eyes scanned the page slowly, the familiar handwriting of a daughter who had long stopped explaining herself. His shoulders didn't slump. His face didn't crack. But his grip tightened so faintly, even the paper seemed to hold its breath. Back at the platform, Oliver stood on his own now, sweat beaded on his forehead. His shirt clung to his back, but he didn't reach for help. He just stood. No one clapped. And somehow, that silence said more than applause ever could. People didn't walk away as they usually did. They lingered. Some sat back down on the grass. Others looked up from their phones. There was a subtle shift, like something unspoken had moved in them, or maybe unlocked. One woman near the back turned to the man beside her and asked, "What do we do if he walks again?" The man didn't answer, but neither of them looked away. Jonathan helped Oliver back into his chair, not because the boy needed it, but because the moment had done what it came to do. He glanced back at the crowd. The cameras had lowered. The questions had stopped. And for once, no one was asking about legality. No one was quoting policy. They were just watching, as if suddenly remembering what hope looked like when it wasn't packaged in credentials, as if wondering what else they had once dismissed, not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't come with a stamp. Jonathan looked over his shoulder. Hargrove was still there, still holding the letter, and this time, he wasn't holding it like evidence. The hallway behind the old city office in Beacon smelled faintly of furniture polish and long-settled dust. Jonathan paused at the wooden door at the end, unmarked, except for the worn brass handle that had seen decades of political hands pass through. He knocked once, didn't wait for an answer, and pushed it open. Inside, the room was modest. A single bookshelf lined one wall, half filled with codes and legislation manuals, their spines bleached by time. The air conditioning clicked softly, keeping the air just cold enough to discourage lingering. Behind the desk, Dean Hargrove sat still, glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose, pen in hand but unmoving. He didn't offer a chair. He didn't ask why Jonathan had come. Jonathan stepped forward. His voice was low, firm, and stripped of anything performative. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here because my son walked yesterday, 3 steps, in front of a crowd that didn't believe, and I think, deep down, you never stopped believing either." Hargrove didn't look up. His hand tightened slightly on the pen. "I read your daughter's letter," Jonathan said, laying a folded copy on the corner of the desk. "Not because I wanted leverage, but because it reminded me of my own fear. The way we cover pain with rules. The way we convince ourselves silence is safer than being wrong." Hargrove's eyes shifted, slow, like someone waking up from a long, cold nap. He said nothing. Jonathan stepped closer. "You called Cohen a risk, but you knew. You knew what he offered wasn't false hope. It was something the system doesn't measure dignity. That girl, your daughter, she didn't ask for miracles. She just wanted to be treated like she mattered." Hargrove finally looked at him. His voice cracked around the edges, but the core was still there, precise, guarded. "You think I don't know Cohen has helped people? I do. But personal faith isn't enough to rewrite standards. The moment I endorse what he does, I invalidate everything I've spent 40 years building." Jonathan's reply came without delay. "Then maybe it's time to ask what that 40 years were for. Because if the system can't bend for people like Oliver, like your daughter, then who exactly is it built to serve silence, stretched thin between them?" Outside the window, the sky had turned the color of old parchment. Afternoon sun spilled onto the dusty floor, catching in the grain of the wooden desk, the edges of old legislation folders, the crack in the clock's glass cover. Hargrove stood, walked to the window with his back turned. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Jonathan waited, not pressing, not pleading. At last. Hargrove spoke. The words came out tired, but honest. "I won't file another complaint. That's as far as I can go. I can't stand beside you in public, but I also won't stand in your way." Jonathan nodded. "That's all I asked." On his way out, he passed the same clock he'd seen when he entered. It ticked softly behind him, a sound so small it almost felt like forgiveness. Maya stood waiting under the eaves, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. Her eyes searched his face. Did he say anything? Jonathan didn't answer right away. He looked out at the quiet town square, the faint movement of the wind and the flags above the courthouse. the way light spilled across the bricks like a quiet path leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Then he said, he didn't forgive Cohen. Not exactly. Maya frowned. Then what did he do? Jonathan exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. He forgave himself. The room on the 7th floor of the New York Times building wasn't meant for revelation. It was quiet, corporate, the kind of space that usually held quarterly reports or cautious denials. But that morning, the usual press kits and branded backdrops were missing. No podium logo, no catered coffee, just rows of folding chairs, a plain wooden lectern, and a framed photo resting on the table beside it. Oliver, mid-step in the sunlight, Maya's hand gently steadying him. Jonathan adjusted the microphone once, then took a breath. He didn't hold any papers. He hadn't prepared a speech. He just stood there, sleeves rolled, tie missing, as if stripped of everything but the truth. I used to think being a good father meant having control. He began, voice low but steady. Control over outcomes, over risks, over fear. I thought if I could just hire the best, build the safest world around my son, I could protect him from everything that hurt. But I was wrong. No camera flashed. No murmurs stirred the crowd. Just the hum of ceiling lights and the distant echo of traffic 7 stories below. He nodded toward the photo. That step you see. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a cure. It was something more fragile, more powerful. It was belief not in science or faith or law, but in possibility. In giving someone the space to try without demanding proof first. He paused, looking at Maya. She stood at the edge of the room, hands clasped in front of her, her hair still damp from the rain outside. Someone motioned for her to join him at the mic, but she shook her head gently. Instead, Oliver stood, legs still unsteady but more confident than they'd ever seen him. He reached for her hand and led her forward. The boy's voice was quiet, but clear. I walked because I wanted to, not because someone fixed me, because they didn't stop me from trying. There was no applause, no buzz of approval, just stillness, the kind that happens when people realize they've just witnessed something that doesn't need convincing. A veteran NBC reporter, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, approached Maya afterward, his tone gentle. Ever consider studying rehab science? There are scholarships, real ones for people like you, people who get it. Maya smiled, but said nothing. Not because she didn't care, but because something in her had shifted. Not toward ambition or opportunity, but toward something steadier direction. And in that moment, she didn't need to name it. She just needed to keep walking. Outside, the clouds had started to part, and somewhere beneath the weight of the city, an old man sat in a wooden office, reading a letter one more time, silently rewriting what it meant to stand by the rules. Jonathan stepped out of the conference center, feeling the wind shift against his collar. He didn't look back, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to. The hearing room at the New York State Medical Board building on East 161st Street was nearly full by the time Jonathan and Maya arrived. Rows of observers, medical students, rehab nurses. A few veterans in wheelchairs sat shoulder to shoulder beside policymakers and reporters from every major outlet. At the center was a long table where a placard read, "Final Review, Unauthorized Rehabilitation Practices." Jonathan didn't speak. He had no speech prepared, no data. His role was not to prove, but to accompany. Maya sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap, a quiet determination hiding behind her lowered eyes. Then he entered. Dr. Alan Cohen, older and smaller than most had imagined, stepped into the room without entourage or hesitation. His clothes were plain, no white coat, no title badge, just a quiet man with silver hair, a slightly hunched back, and eyes that had once held 100 children's secrets. When the chairwoman called him to the front, there was no shuffle of papers, no murmur of protest, just the sound of his shoes against the linoleum floor. Cohen stood at the microphone and adjusted it slowly. He looked over the room, not scanning for allies or enemies, just acknowledging the presence of everyone there. Then, in a voice that barely carried beyond the first few rows, he said, I don't cure. I sit. I listen. I remind a child that their body might still be listening too. He stepped back. That was it. The chairwoman blinked, unsure if he had finished, but he had already returned to his seat. Silence stretched. Then a voice broke it. I'd like to speak. Everyone turned. Maya had risen from her seat. She was not on the schedule. The chairwoman hesitated, looked toward legal counsel, then, after a breath, gave a small nod. Maya stepped forward. She didn't look around, didn't search for cameras. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, not rehearsed, not decorated. I was 8 when I was told I might never walk again. No insurance, no family left. I ended up in the Bronx in a state-run facility where they lock the doors at night like you're contagious. No one taught me to believe in recovery, just how to wait out time. She paused, eyes flicking toward Cohen. Then he came, not with pills or machines, just a blanket, a timer, and a question. Do you want to try? Not even, do you believe? Just, do you want to try? That saved me. She turned toward the panel. You want to know if what he does is medicine? I don't know. But I know it gave me the will to keep trying. And now I walk. And now I help other kids like Oliver. Maybe it doesn't fit in your categories, but it fits in their lives. She stepped back, her shoes tapping once on the floor. Then came the moment no one expected. From the far end of the panel, where the most vocal opponent had sat through every session with crossed arms and a disapproving frown, a chair scraped softly. Mr. Leonard Carver, a man known for dismantling fringe medical practices with brutal precision, stood. I have a nephew, he said slowly. Spinal cord trauma, motorcycle accident, 8 months ago. He looked at Cohen, then back at the board. I never thought of bringing him to someone like you. I thought I knew better. But maybe I've known too narrowly. Maybe it's time we widen the frame. A silence fell, not stunned, but shifted, as if the room itself exhaled. The chairwoman leaned into her mic, voice softer now. Dr. Cohen, would you be willing to meet Mr. Carver's nephew? Cohen simply nodded. No formal votes were cast that day, no rulings handed down, but something real had moved. Not policy, not precedent, perspective. Outside the chamber, under the stone awning. Jonathan and Maya paused before stepping into the sunlight. She glanced up at him. Do you think this means we've won? He smiled, but shook his head. No, but I think we were heard. And sometimes, that's the part that changes people more than winning. 3 months later, on a quiet corner of East 77th Street, a narrow building opened its doors under soft spring light. No banners, no ribbon. Just a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Oliver's Hope, Community Recovery Studio. Inside. The floors creaked under secondhand mats. The walls held no plaques. Only sketches drawn by children, some showing stick figures standing for the first time, others just sunlight over grass. In one corner, a young boy with braces on his legs counted aloud as he balanced on one foot. Across the room, a teenager helped her grandmother up from a chair, both laughing softly. At the heart of it all was Maya. She now wore a soft blue name tag, Maya Ortiz, assistant instructor. A scholarship had arrived 2 weeks after the press conference, sent not by an institution, but by a collective of therapists, nurses, and social workers who had watched her speak and said, simply, we believe in her. Each morning, Maya arrived before the others. She would sweep the hallway, adjust the old chairs so they didn't wobble, and reread passages from Cohen's notebook, the one he left on her desk the morning he disappeared. He hadn't said goodbye, just a folded note. You know what to do. Keep going. Oliver trained twice a week now. He no longer used a walker. Sometimes he'd slip, sometimes he'd tire, but he always got up, always with a quiet hand reaching back for his father. Jonathan had learned to stay behind him, not in front. He didn't cheer, didn't direct. He just followed, open-palmed and present. The same man who once spoke only in firm instructions now sat quietly beside parents who were scared, listening without needing to fix. One Thursday afternoon, the sunlight came through the long front window, dust caught in the warmth. Maya stepped out from the therapy room, her sleeves rolled high, a pencil still tucked behind her ear. Waiting by the front desk was a girl maybe 9 with deep brown eyes and a pair of pink crutches. Her mother sat beside her, filling out a form slowly, as if unsure of every answer. The girl looked at Maya, hesitant. "Are you the one who helps kids walk again?" Maya knelt beside her, resting a hand gently over the girl's heart. "No," she said, "but I'll sit with you while you try. That's how it starts." The girl stared at her, then nodded just once. As Maya stood, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the glass door. Not as she had been alone, unsure, but as she had become, still quiet, still learning, but standing. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't look back into the room. She said nothing more. She just walked out with her head held high, and behind her, the door eased shut on its own, not as an ending, but as the kind of beginning only someone who had once been told no could recognize as hope. The hallway still smelled faintly of eucalyptus and old vinyl mats. Somewhere in the back room, a child's laughter echoed unsteady but real, and outside, the city moved on, unaware that something small and stubborn had taken root behind an unmarked door. Not every scar fades, not every question finds its answer, but sometimes, all it takes is one person who doesn't look away. And maybe that's how change begins. Quietly, with someone still standing there, holding the door open.